What's up, Sam?
So I don't know, Ian hasn't joined on yet, but I'm sure he'll get here. Probably best to get started as we'll have till 2:30 probably on this one. And then as Chap said, maybe a part 2, 3, 4, who knows, go. But I'm just going to toss the reins over here to Chaps and thank him for maybe being volunteering, not sure, to moderate this session for us on our Standing on the Shoulder of Giants. And I'm pretty stoked because every one of these on the panel has been a big mentor of mine as well throughout my career. So pretty excited to sit back and listen to this history lesson. So take it away there, Chaps.
Thanks, Sam. Welcome, everyone. So as Sam said, it was kind of a voluntold. People wanted to hear Mr. Chris Dalcin, and someone suggested this, so we're going to run with it. And it's fitting because he was one of my biggest mentors, as was all of the people that were going to get involved today. They've all strongly influenced me, and I think they've influenced Ontario in general, S&C. And I want to base this around a quote by Sir Isaac Newton, as Sam already said: "If I have seen further than others, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants." The discussions on these talks so far have been around our current situation and where we are going from here and coming back from it. But I'm a big fan of history, and I think that in order to know where we're going, we must know where we've came from. So I want to dive a bit into the history. And you know, all 5 of these guys have influenced me as a coach, and I look up to them not only as examples of how to be a successful strength coach, but how to be as a human. I think these individuals have influenced how I am as a person and how I've given back. And kind of the article that I sent out was influenced by all these gentlemen. And the reason why I teach and I give back is because of what they've done to me. So I could take this whole meeting talking about these individuals and how I feel about them, but I've already taken long enough. So what I want to do is turn the mic over to Chris Dalcin to start. And since you've been doing S&C longer than anyone in this group that I'm aware of, I want you to take us back to the start. How did you get into this industry? And let's go through the first decade of your career.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Got me? Can I show you a little?
Yes, sir. Share what you.
Now, first of all, you guys see that?
Yep, we got you. And Sam will be our tech operator. If we
Can you see that graphic? Sorry about the date at the bottom. Didn't look at that, but okay. Currently, right now, I've just finished, obviously, you can look at the date at the bottom, till COVID, was working in, probably call it developmental program at Etobicoke Swimming. Unique in that it makes you go back and dig up all the old stuff you used to do when I was working at the Fitness Institute back in the day. But it really was refreshing in that you're working with kids that are wide-eyed. They hadn't been influenced too much by a lot of different people, but and some of them were pretty high performance. I think over the years you get a chance. The more you see great athletes, they got that look in their eye. And there's one girl I hope you guys keep an eye on. She's going to be a real champion, I think. And just the way her attitude and her approach to the sport is unheralded. I've seen a lot of great athletes. She's up there in that kind of category. But what I'm doing, and just some basic things with swimming, this was a chance. Some of you guys could have been there when Derek Hansen hosted a regional NSCA event out west. He had Alvar Mieltalk, famous strength coach, worked in track and field. His brother was an NFL football coach. Well, what I'm really kind of focusing now is the basis, the bottom of the pyramid with this swimming, and just getting this. This is something you may see in a 25-year-old athlete that has bad nutrition, bad sleep habits, a lot of things, but it really is the foundation of world-class sports. So that's what I feel. As I'm doing the basics, it's back to sleep, it's back to hydration, it's back to nutrition. And So it's not as much high performance, but obviously it's important, it's foundational. I work a little bit with Gavin Smelly out at track and field. Every time I work with track and field, I've left, but they pull me back in. Gavin's a great guy, making another kick at the can. He was all in line, I think, to make the relay team this year, but been pushed back a year. This was my last national team, women's basketball. That was a lot of fun, a lot of work, a lot of travel. I was wearing a lot of different hats doing that, sports science, strength and conditioning, a little bit of nutrition, but I loved every minute of it. These are the kind of teams that I've worked in and out with for years. But my true evolution, I went 1979, went to the University of Toronto School of Physical and Health Education. And people that really influenced me, Bob Good taught physiology. He loved it. He made you love it. Andy Higgins, a lot of you know, was the decathlete national team coach. He was my actual first prof, introduction to phys ed, and known him right up until he passed away a few years back. Kept in touch. He ran the Canadian Coaching Association. But here's a man, again, talk about watershed moments. Roy Shepard was a MD and a PhD in epidemiology, and he was our dean. And I mimicked him in a variety show. I was doing the cheese skit, the Monty Python cheese skit, and I pretended I was Roy Shepard. And I was called into his office a couple days later. I thought I was going to get kicked out because I got a 49 in Rock 101. And turns out he loved it. He's an old British guy, so he loved British comedy, but he slides this magazine over across his desk to me. And this was the, I don't know, third or fourth year of the National Strength and Conditioning Association. And this is what the magazine looked like for everybody that's applied, and now you get it online. Every magazine started with a graphic of a sport showing the musculatures that was being used, and had javelin throwing and all. My eyes just went bug-eyed. And I said, and he goes, "This is something you may want to get involved with." So in his little way, and I had never had conversations with Shepard, this is what he kind of picked it out that I may like this. So I graduated and I ended up at the Fitness Institute. We were in 3 locations, downtown Toronto, Mississauga, and Willowdale. We served executive members, but in the back room, first of all, the owner of the place was a 2-time Olympian. He was in 60 and 64. He was a javelin thrower first, then became a decathlete. He was the owner, and he kind of looked at this place as being a great place for executives to train, but he was laying the foundation for kind of a regional place that athletes could come and train. So if you're a nationally trained athlete, and at the time carded on a list, you got to come to our clubs for free. A lot of guys don't know who this man is, but Lloyd Percival was the guy brought in to run the clubs, and his reputation was that he was called the coach. But if there's something in history you guys got to go back and look at, he wrote this book. In Canada, nobody even knew about it. You'd be hard-pressed to find this in a library today. I have a copy. I wish it was signed by Lloyd, but he's passed away a long time before I started with them. But this became the Bible of the Russians, the Russian hockey system. So I know when the Blue Jays won, it was big, and I know when we won Canada Cups, and I know when we won the Toronto Raptors. I don't think there was a bigger thing in Canada than the Canada-Russia series. It was 8 games, 4 in Canada, 4 in Russia, and we had won, but we had saw a type of hockey nobody had ever seen before. And they pull out this book, and they show it to the press, and they say, "We want to meet this man." And back then, they all went, "No, he's just crazy. He's a track coach." But it was the Bible, and this is the stuff that people were starting to write about Lloyd Percival. That's him in our gym back in the day. So he was a big, just the fact that I was under his premises, but he was a big influence. And then I walked into a facility that had everything. I mean, everything. I was part of the fitness testing coaching part, but we got to work with some really important people. And Stevie, you'll get a big kick out of the guy in the bottom left. But We had a medical director. We had Charles Bull was the best orthopedic surgeon in Canada. He worked with all the national teams. A lady who really understood, I couldn't find a picture of her, sport nutrition, like a real applied sport nutrition. We had a great physio, worked on every national team. But this was the guy, and then Bo Kant was our fitness director and then became a big part of George Brown College's fitness and lifestyle management course. But this man in the top left medical clinic, he changed my life. He really was a big part of why I'm doing what I'm doing today. And this was, today we coined the phrase IST, Integrated Sport Team. We had it. I didn't know we had it, but we had it at the time. And then everybody came through our facility had to go through. I mean, everywhere. We had 6,000 members at all three clubs combined. And everybody had to go through a Astran rhyming test, to a 2-lead ECG. Everybody was trained on ECG detection. Again, Steve will laugh at the little 2-lead graphic picture up on the right. Every push-ups got, and this is something, and we programmed from this. It wasn't willy-nilly. Everything was based on functional capacity. So, and this wasn't as easy as you think. This little ECG strip would go across the paper. We had to slap a ruler on it, look from R to R wave, figure out heart rate, quickly write it down, and then go to the next step. It was really, it made you fast on your feet. It was quite fun, but again, every member had to go through this at the beginning 3 times a year, and then at least once a year after that. But the number one thing, and again, Chris brought it up at the beginning, is he defined us as coaches. We were out on that gym floor. That was the gym I joined. This is a little older photo because, again, Lloyd wasn't alive. But that's the gym I worked in. Just take a look at what you see. Slant boards, boxes. A lot of people did boxes because the big thing was the step test. Monarch bikes and a track to run and a spit sink for the men. We could spit between laps. But this again, my guru, the genius, Dr. Frank Burka, Czechoslovakian expatriate, came to Canada, was a cardiac rehab specialist. And we got money from the Best Ever program. It was a product of the early lottery. And we bought all this equipment at all 3 clubs, metabolic cart, ECG, 12-lead ECG, a big bike. But here was the thing. I had to become the cardiac coordinator if I wanted to be working with high-performance athletes, because we use the same equipment that we use for cardiacs. We use the same equipment for high-performance athletes. And understand, that's one thing I tell most people. For years and years and years, and this is true of even, the Russian Federation and the East Germans, we were living on the coattails of medical science. Medicine kind of led high performance in Canada and around the world, and especially on the cheating side. But this is what you had to know to really get foundational for high performance. So we approached the government. This was a thing that, because we had such highfalutin people like Charles Bull and all these other people, Lloyd Percival, we approached the government and they gave a sanction called the High Performance Center. And we were actually given the rings. We're the only non-university setting to be giving this sanction. And we went through accreditation. We had to make sure all our stuff was in place. But this really opened our doors to more comprehensive kind of work with national teams. I wasn't there for 2 weeks. My feet to the fire. We had a contract. We did, testing on Toronto Maple Leafs back then, Poirier Salming and that era. It was overwhelming, but I loved it. Absolutely loved it. And we were using really crude mechanisms to do a Wingate test and all that. Started working with, especially New Jersey Devils, but we started doing all these testings for different teams with the same people. And I stupidly recommended to the people at New Jersey, why wouldn't you guys get together and test the same people and share the data? And that became if you went to York, you would have been involved in the testing there, but this became Central Scouting. And they do all the testing that was done up into York University until a few years ago. Again, watershed moments. A friend of mine, he was a linebacker on the Blues. Phys Ed was doing his master's, and he had heard about this guy, Tudor Bump at York University. And he was lecturing, so we all went. We couldn't understand a word he said. And there was an older version of this, but it was basically almost handwritten. But there was something really, really, you just exuded confidence and knowledge that there's something really, really important in what he was trying to tell us. And if you guys know, he was kind of the foundational behind, say, Ben Johnson and a few other great athletes in our country on how to train. Ours was seat of the pants up till then. Everybody used to joke. The scouts from New Jersey used to joke, the European scouts, he says, we spend way too much time on our back training in Canada. And he says, we're all bodybuilders. We're not training for sport. And this was a kind of a heretic kind of talk to Canadians, but they were right. We were training totally wrong. And then he published in '93 this one, which again was my early Bible. But like in research, you go back in simple terms, everything in sport is related to the three, either force or strength, speed, and endurance. And once you got an idea where your sport lies, it just changes how you approach your sport and then all the interplay. But then you like say you read a research paper and you look at the references, it usually leads you somewhere else. And I got a hands on the early kind of stuff, could be in '86. It was all in Russian, but we had a Russian massage therapist, Crazy Mike, that would go through it and kind of tell us. And this was kind of the start of, this guy's kind of known, Verkhoshansky is the kind of the grandfather of it all. But again, just said, look, we've got this all wrong. Let's retool and go at it. I don't want to go through this in definition, but just the way it's broken down, how you correspond your workouts, your training to mimic sport. And then I got another watershed moment. I got a phone call from a friend. His dad's an importer from Italy, and he goes, he wants to know if I want to look at this stuff and become the distributor. And I go, what is it? And he goes, he doesn't know. My father's imports silverware from Italy. So he brings it, and it's a jump mat. It's a timing lights, a controller, and this rate encoder. And I'm going, what the hell is this, right? So I phone Ira Jacobs. We had just done a study with about 40 members of our club. They went through a pretty comprehensive study looking at, for one of his PhD students. He was the head of DCIM, Defense Canada's Institute of Environmental Medicine. I said, what is this? He says, reading, he goes, it's affiliated with this guy, Carmelo Bosco. And Ira starts laughing. I think they did their PhD together in Sweden. And he says, whatever it is, this guy's brilliant, use it. So I started looking around. First of all, here's my muscle biopsy from that study. 50% of each. I wasn't going to go anywhere in sport. So this rate dynamometer, it had a stand with this digital display. You'd put in, you could either have speed, you'd flip a switch, you'd show power, and I'm going, what the hell is this? So this is a Bible everybody should have, if it's only for historical purposes. But this was first published, I think, in '82, and these are big names in sport back in the day. Duncan McDougall, obviously, McMaster, Howie Green at Waterloo. Howie Winger, I think, was UBC, but sure enough, they were only editors. They were looking out to find the people in the world that were doing research on sport. And so as editors, but the third paragraph, and you Mac guys will get a kick, Digby Sale did the thing on testing for power. So what I did is I used that. Basically, I'm telling you, I had to get graph paper. This is before Excel and be able to drive graphs. I plotted the speed that dropped and the power in watts that went up, and back calculated to force. And the inverse relationship was that power somewhere was the most at about 50, 60% of 1 RM. So back then, and this is something I was doing back then, which Myotest used, I broke it up and we used these kind of categories to train. This was off the charts, just different. And I was looking, this is the way we used to program it, a Tudor Bumble way. Then I got my hands on my first computer. No word of a lie, that was the one I had. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. And then I met these two guys, went to school with them, but we had a summer hockey program. There's Pete and John. A lot of you guys have crossed their paths. Great guys, absolutely great. They took care of everything hockey. I was in charge of all their testing. We did pretty well by ourselves. And we were a little bit, we were using a lot of tutor stuff, and we were using a little bit of avant-garde kind of training, and obviously saw some success. But this, again, another watershed moment. 2 athletes approached me, called them long in the tooth. Renee Simpson on the left was Canada's kind of #1 girl. She was as high as 70 in the world. She was like close to 300. She goes, I want to give it one good chance. And I said, okay, we're going to do it my way. She said, fine. She was sitting in there doing tricep extensions with like 5 pounds. That was the extent of her workouts in our gym. And then Brian Stemmel approached me, and there was inkling that they were trying to push Brian out just before the Nagano Olympics. So he said, I want to forgo going out west and to Calgary and going down to South America ski. I want to work with you. I said, sure, right? So again, I said, we'll do it our way. And I just used the technology. I just started saying, let's think outside the box. So I started working. You guys have all seen this. I think this is on, what's his name's website, the Tendo website. But this is what most of the research was talking about, that if you work within the maximum power zone, you're going to get the best explosive power results. So we were all using, 1RM as our basis up until that point. But I said, okay, I'm going to work with this. So built the preface, and again, these guys went on, and Renee moved up to about 80 again, made some serious good money to retire on. Brian got to #7 in the world in downhill, and you guys that are old enough, it's probably one of the most heartbreaking things. He was on the last transition of the downhill, pretty well flat, coming into a flat section. He was 4/10 up. And 4/10 is like having a 50-yard lead in a 100-meter dash. He catches a rut and misses the gate, and just the whole countryside. But it was unbelievable. But great guy, great to work with, and just carte blanche on how to train. And that was different. We did basically all this kind of stuff. Early on, I learned to coin a phrase, IMCA, or an acronym for Intended Maximum Concentric Acceleration. And this is something I still do to this day, that if power and speed is your thing, is what you do on the concentric portion of your squat, of your bench press, whatever it is. It's got to have intention. It's got to be focused. It may look a little bit crazy, but I want the bench press to make your upper body leave the bench. You're going to your tiptoes, if not leaving the ground on a squat. So it became really, really focused training. Everything leads to good things. You start with Renee. She sends me Sonia J. Seelan. She gets up to 40 in the world. Obviously, Daniel Nestor for years. Sorry, you got to go back. I had the top 2 juniors in Canada, Petra Marinova, women's, and then I couldn't find a picture of Joel DeCont, but he was #1 boy. So that's how, at the end of the day, you lead down a path that usually takes you somewhere. That was a busy time. And then Brian, just recommendations. I used to help do testing, and you'll notice a face in there, Chappie, that we talked about, or you emailed me a couple days ago, but right, I'll show you. But there's Brian, Eddie Podovinsky, and Graydon Oldfield, where the guys had started coming to us. And then that's Carson. Remember him, Chris? You said you. So I started working. That's basically how you just kind of cascades. And then again, Shell, you know this team. You were our direct competition, personal best. We ran a Team XL. We had Steve Bentley, had his bunch. So I started doing triathletes. This was revenue gen. So all of a sudden I just said, I don't need the Fitness Institute. I only need their space. And I went out on businesses of my own. And that was a hard thing going into national teams. Once you start getting into business, anytime you go to camps and stuff like it, you're cutting into your business. But this is where we're going to kind of start off, and end off, and I'll open it up to anything you guys want to do. Robert Bethauer, who was Debbie Lowe's predecessor, they started up the National Sports Center with national team funding. And this was the precursor, obviously, of the CSIO. And Robert brought us in as a round table, and at it was Sheldon, Dr. Gledhill from York University Physiology. We had three really high-level sport doctors in Clarefield, Dr. Gallia, I'm missing somebody, but we had Marlene Nobrega from Physio. We had the brain trust, and then we were going, how do we take this and make it what it is today? And we became kind of the consultants. We kind of laid down what became the Sports Center, and that was a lot of fun. It's nice to know when you're doing good work, you kind of get brought in to do the next level of foundational work. And then they just started sending me more people. Once you got affiliated with that and told them, a big part of the meeting, Shell, you'll remember this, was setting a price point. Do you charge $150 to a person off the street for a VO2 max? What can you do it for? Peter Fonseca, who's a marathon runner for Canada. Yeah, I can do it for 50. So once you set a price point and become the ipso facto training center, because we had 3 gyms and we had high performance testing. And remember, every team back in those days had money that had to be designated for testing. Whether they knew it or not, it was part and parcel, so they had to use it up, and we were the benefit of that. So there's a picture that I kept, that's Elvis Stoico. He came all the way from Barrie to say he didn't want to do any of the testing except for his body fat. But that's the staff we had around for one day, because high profile. And that's where I'm going to leave it. If any questions, or Chris, you want to take it?
Let's start with just questions, and even from our panel. Where does that journey take you guys?
Hey, Chris, the person that was around the table for that meeting was the gentleman at U of T who used to also work with the CSIO, Greg Wells.
Greg Wells was there, you're right, as a physiologist, yeah. But that was, you know, in 2000, you started hearing, especially after Sydney Olympics, that institutes were Germany's already had it. A lot of other places had it. And we're going, wow, we remember where the meeting was, Shell. It was at Downsview. And there was talk we were going to take a huge parcel of land in Downsview of these old buildings. And before I went to university, I worked at a year and a half at de Havilland Aircraft, building the Dash 7 airplane. And that was basically the kitty corner, the far corner from where the National Training Center was going to open up. And they had plans, beautiful, drawn up. And in hindsight, knowing that the subway's there, and it would have been a great site for Canada and Toronto, because obviously centrally located, big parcel of land. It was owned by the military, and that was the headache. Military never really wanted to give it up, but their politics got involved, and then it ended up in Scarborough. Did a great job on it, but this was just the start of Canada becoming a big thinker in the world of sport, and that was really, really exciting for me. And a testament of all the hard work, not people like me, but all my heroes and my molders, for lack of a better word.
Amazing. So given Sheldon was around for that, Sheldon, I'd like to call on you. Let's kind of, since Chris started 79, so let's talk about the 80s, and we'll pull in Ian here as well. But Sheldon, why don't you give a quick overview of how you got in and your time in the industry in the 80s?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Chris, Sam, Trev, Jordan, for organizing. This is great fun. It's been 3 or 4 weeks in a row of some excellent conversations. I apologize I wasn't able to join last Friday, but Sam was kind enough to send me the tape recording, so I did listen to it from beginning to end, and again, great conversations. The 80s, love the 80s. I started my first job as a coach was 1986, and no clue what was going on, really. It was a basketball team, and the way it worked out is the convener of the league was one of my teachers who asked me to fill in because a coach had dropped out of the league at the last minute. And so what I did, I was coaching kids, it was co-ed, and we would do practice, technical stuff, then we would do their conditioning stuff, and then on another day we would have their games. And again, really no clue what was going on. And I can tell you something, as somebody who is extremely anal, and I can tell you I'm not nearly as anal today as I used to be, but if you want to learn about coaching and spending time practicing and planning for a training session, try and coach kids, because 3 minutes into the session, your plan goes out the window. So I'm telling you, in terms of a coaching experience, it was absolutely unbelievable. And the reality is I don't necessarily consider myself a strength and conditioning coach first. I consider myself a coach first. And everything that I do is trying to become a better coach. Strength and conditioning is one area that I coach. But I'm a huge proponent or a huge fan of the NCCP, National Coaching Certification Program. And in the 80s and 90s, I took as many coaching certification courses as possible. So I'm certified in 6 different sports as a coach within the NCCP, and I've coached at level 4 and 5 level. I've helped develop NCCP courses, and I tell you that it's a great foundation. And I always look to the NCCP and the NCCP as being a part of the leaders in the world in terms of coaching education. Irrelevant whether you're a strength and conditioning coach or not, I think it has some great things in there that we all can benefit from, whether you're a sport coach or a strength and conditioning coach. So within the 80s and the late 80s, Chris mentioned Duncan McDougall and Digby Sale, and I was fortunate to have both of them as professors, huge mentors of mine. I'm telling you, Digby Sale, in terms of muscle physiology, absolutely brilliant. And people are still citing his research today that were from the 70s and 80s, and he was way ahead of his time. But having the opportunity to learn from those two guys, absolutely phenomenal. Another person that I had a great chance to learn from, and Chris mentioned, was Andy Higgins. And Andy Higgins, both my business partner and I went to McMaster, and we were at Mac in terms of doing our undergrad in the late 80s. Peter Twist was in my business partner's class, and I know that a lot of other coaches who were in and around the area at the time went to Mac. So again, I had a real fortunate opportunity to learn from some phenomenal individuals. So then going into the 90s, Barry, my business partner, and I started our own company in 1991, and we've been together ever since. And essentially, our company, what we do is we have 3 divisions of our company. One is coaching, testing, and training. The other is corporate facility. So we manage about 6 facilities in and around Ontario. And the 3rd division is camps and events. So camps and events, we'll do camps and events in Canada, the US, and in Europe as well, being able to primarily deal with actually endurance trained athletes. And in around the late 90s, and I'll stop here, is when Chris's slide ended off. And I was, again, fortunate enough, the first national team I worked with, athletes, was alpine skiing through the National Sports Center in the late 90s, which changed to the Canadian Sports Center, which is now the Canadian Sport Institute. So I'll leave it at there, because I know we definitely want to hear from Steve and Ian as well. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, guys.
Okay, so next I'm going to pull Ian. I haven't seen his face yet pop up. So Ian, same thing. Give us your story from the start, and let's keep it old school right now.
There's a lot of can you hear me? Yeah, there's a lot of similarities in terms of where Sheldon's coming from, but I want to preface it with saying that I don't know why I'm on this list, and I figure it's because of my age. So because you guys, every one of you, I've learned a lot from, and there's names going down the list that, like, wow, we've had great conversations. The only one I don't think I met, and I'll call you Mr. Lidstone, but I've run into many of your students, and nothing but good words, and I hear so much about you. But it's just kind of an honor to be here. But I'm kind of the antithesis of everything here, because really, I don't know, Chris will probably remember weeder weights with the cement, the plastic cement. Okay, that's how I started at 11 years old. But the first Gold's Gym opened up in 1987. And that was like, wow. You know, me and my boys, we lifted for like 4 hours the first day, and we were sore as hell. Went back the next day, did the same thing. It was crazy times. But The year before that, I came in third in long jump for OFSA, and I was behind 2 Olympians. I missed second by 4 centimeters. So that next year technically was my year, whether it's long jump, 4x1, 100 meters. And when that gym opened, I gained 35 pounds. Did absolutely no running. I just lifted. And what do you think happened? Absolutely nothing. Everybody's like, what happened to you? I mean, I was bigger, but I couldn't do anything. So that was the first lesson in terms of, as you go further down the road, that you have to keep practicing your sport, do what you need to do while you're engaging any sort of activity like that, including mobility work. Because this is how I would scratch my neck. I was so muscle bound, couldn't touch my toes, all that kind of stuff. But I was a competitive bodybuilder with my wife as well, up until a couple of years after the second kid was born. And I kind of got out of it. I was on the floor at Goals until it folded. It turned over to Premier, and then another gym took it over. Then now it's a condo. It was just down Eglinton and Bermondsey. So I kind of got out of it, but as the kids started to get older, I started coaching football. So I'm like Sheldon. I consider myself more as a coach. And coaching kids really humbles you and gets you back to learning how to really teach things and put together your system so kids, especially in football, don't get hurt. So as we went along, I coached all the way up to high school, somewhere between, and I'm not sure of the year, but when Chris put up the picture showing Ryan, I met a whole bunch of you guys from the Fitness Institute when A4A opened. And that was supposed to be a football factory for Markham Raiders. I was there and, had great talks, discussions with you guys and intensive programming, everything. And remember Chappie introducing me to the conjugate method. I'm like, ooh, wait, this is, because I was a Tudor bumper guy. That's what Canadian and, but we had great conversations. And I guess through all of that, I brought a lot of football guys in there. I did combine work, and I guess my boys are running for quite some time. And the opportunity, Alex Gardner came and said, would you be interested in working in the S&C side with Chris Dalcin? I'm like, yeah, you kidding? Of course. And that alone, when I met most of you guys and we go to CSI, and that was like drinking through a fire hose, the amount of information that you guys, sent to me, gave to me, had access to, and especially testing. That opened up a whole new world to me. And it's funny that, Chappie, now you're at Push, but when Push came in and they had the Android ban, I'm like dying for the iOS version, just dying, because I've been so used to using Force Plays with Chris and everything. That's like, oh, this is crazy. So that there was, I think, probably one of the highlights, getting into A4A, learning from you guys and meeting other people. I met Trevor through HPT. I was introduced to you with some HPT, and I was like, okay, what do you think you can learn from me? And that helped me grow. A lot of mistakes made, but that helped me grow further as an individual I am. And from the work I did with Chris, or under Chris, because Chris was the lead, it's funny how a lot of people start coming towards you and saying, okay, can you help me this, can you help me that? Because when I went to A4A, I was the speed guy, and I didn't want anything to do with the speed guy, but it just so happened that was the niche that I was working to, but it allowed me to use all the rest of the skills. Ended up doing speed work for hockey, ended up, really, I think, Chris, you got to speaking on this, but I think we did a real good job in terms of the individuals we had and the tools we had, from the Olympic point of view and the world point of view. And the claim to fame, obviously, is watching that relay team lose that medal in the last round. Heartbreaking, but they made it back in the next couple of worlds. Really, I think if you go back to when this first started, the degree I should have got wish I did and went back, was phys ed at that point. But I remember it's one of these things in your mind. You remember my parents laughing, saying, "What do you want to be, a gym teacher?" But if I was a gym teacher, it would have been a lot farther and more productive for me towards this end of my life. But I really was honestly lucky and blessed to meet a lot of you guys here. You know, I've got a lot of information you guys have given me, the discussions we've had. Chris brought back so much memories with the books and the testing, and you know, having Sheldon, I see Sheldon periodically. He's kind of like a calming voice when I lose my mind at times, but you know, it's been great. And the people that I've met through HPT, Sam, you know, Trevor, when I first spoke to Trevor, I had to put on a pair of Depends because I was just crapping my pants speaking to this guy. And you know, it was great meeting him. But there's a lot of guys on this stream right now that, you know, have been instrumental in my growth, like, you know, point out. And I really appreciate just this opportunity to say, but I tell all the young guys, man, make sure you get your paper because this is the way the industry's going. You know, I got CanFit because I needed insurance. And I remember you talking last week about, or Chris talking about, you know, I have to get some insurance, and it sort of legitimizes you in a sense because now you can at least get covered. But the NSCA was around 2007, and they didn't have the other designation yet. So that was my default, and I took other certifications, but I realized, like, geez, I'm just paying money for certifications, and it's not really doing much for me. But learning from the environment that, you know, I was in with you guys and Chris, I owe you, like, I don't know what to say, big time. Love you, man, because, you know, I learned so much from this guy, and, you know, I've got his back. I've seen him through highs and lows, and, you know, it's just a pity. But, you know, I'm glad you're back in track. Keep going.
Can't get rid of me.
And yeah, no. But really, I mean, from all that, I've met so many chiros. I've met individuals from Exos, Altus. One of my coaching mentors is down at Altus. It's just been a cascade of individuals. There's so many people, and I've, you know, been reaching out slowly as this situation has gone on to say, hey, how you doing? And but really, that's it in a nutshell. And now I've been kind of in the shadows. I've been doing, still doing football, bobsled for the last 5 years, and I'm just having fun, trying to have fun. That's basically it. But appreciate all you guys, and thank you for having me.
So Ian, for the people that don't know, because I was fortunate enough to watch you, and you taught me a lot about sprinting, you know, being on the track at A4A for years, about your sons, and that's kind of why you're here as well, is you've produced some of the fastest humans that I've ever witnessed. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's been a
megabit, man. Stop being too humble.
Well, you know, it's I got to remember, okay, what I missed from CSI was the IST part, because I realized that, you know, you have to build your own IST in itself. But it was part of a team, because there's been a lot of coaches involved, a lot of therapists involved, you know, a lot of physio, a lot of chiro, everything. So it's not just, you know, nutrition, everything else. And I've got to thank them, really, literally, that my basement is just loaded with equipment. So I'm just lifting like a fiend. I'm fine. I'm laughing right now. But it's part of, it's been a long journey watching them go through their ups and downs through the NCAA system, track itself. But, you know, it's a humbling experience, because, you know, making it once is like, you know, it's hard, it's tough. Making it another time is damn near impossible. And, you know, they were trying to do that, but, you know, it just never happened. But it was a great experience. I mean, seeing Olympic Games was, you know, again, the other highlight. And watching how, you know, guys you watch on TV, like watching Bolt barely run down the track, get warmed up on a table, and he was fine, take a couple strides, come back, you get adjusted, take a couple strides, come back, then he'd sit in the call room for, an hour. Meanwhile, our guys dripping, sweating, losing energy, and he'd get right on the track, do one block start, and gone. So that's when I realized through some of these other therapists that, you don't necessarily have to waste all that energy, but, there's things that can be done to mitigate any sort of reduction in power output or getting cold. So being where I was at CSI, I'd ask Chris all the time, so what do you think of this? And what do you think of that? Or, and he'd just tell me straight. So great experience. And it's a hard one, a long one. But I wouldn't have traded it for the world, period.
Amazing. So Sam, I'm going to call this now. One thing that we should do down the road is have a speed one. I think it'd be good to get Ian and maybe Joey and a few others that have been around it and lived it. So I'm just going to write that one down now. You brought up Trev a bunch, Ian. Let's go to Trev and get your story, Trev, because you said you started in the 80s as well.
Yeah. I started in the 80s. I'm going to maybe try a little screen share here. I started actually early 80s, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about my lineage and that, because that's kind of boring. Most of you have kind of been around me before and you've heard the story. But if you didn't know this, a lot of strength culture came from this magazine ad. And this is how I got into lifting weights. Back in the day, we didn't have much information, so we relied on anything we could find in the street corners or libraries, which there wasn't much. But this ad is what got me into strength training. When I was 10 years old, I saw this ad and I going, how do you get muscles? How do you get muscles? I always wanted to be bigger and stronger. I was kind of a skinny kid, a bit of a runner jumper kind of kid. And I said, I want to get stronger. And I always thought, should I send money? I think it was like 30 cents you're supposed to send in a postage paid envelope, and you get the Charles Atlas plan. But anyway, I didn't end up getting that. But what I did was get something similar to what Ian got. Ian, you may remember this system. So the York Barbell Training System, cast cement plates. And this is the actual program I got in that package. And I actually did this. I did the deep knee bends, and I have no idea what some of these things are, but I did them because I didn't know anything else to do. But then I found the Mecca. What did I get here? This Sports Fitness magazine. This started publishing in 1985. So by then I'd already be training 3-4 years. And I discovered this and I thought I'd achieved nirvana as a young 13, 14-year-old. So back in the 80s, it was all bodybuilding culture. That's all we had. We had bodybuilding culture. And so our workouts, and Ian alluded to this and Chris did too, was just bodybuilding workouts. Joe Wheeler went and repackaged it, sold this magazine. And so all these articles in this, it only was on the shelves for about 2 years because nobody lifted weights in sports back then. It was kind of not the cool thing. So it only lasted for a couple of years, and I was sad when it went away. But Sports Fitness magazine, I read that thing back to back, and Lyle Alzado had articles, and they had articles on Olympic athletes. But basically it was just all the same stuff as muscle and fitness, just reinvented. And then, boy, let me tell you, they sold a lot of supplements, and boy, I bought those supplements. But that's where I got to. But my what I wanted to do in my little 10-minute spiel here is just talk about some of the academic institutions that had a big influence, as some of you have already alluded to, and then talk about a little bit about the history of powerlifting, Olympic lifting, and strongman in Ontario, and how we got to where we are. Because as I said, in the 80s, it was largely bodybuilding dominant. But I was at University of Waterloo. Stu McGill was a young professor then, and he had just wrote an article that changed the world for fitness enthusiasts. And the article was about sit-ups are bad for your back. And all of a sudden, everybody stopped doing sit-ups, and what did? We started doing crunches. The next thing you know, we're not even doing crunches, and now we're doing planks and dead bugs and that kind of thing. Stu McGill was a big thing back then and up and coming, but he had a graduate student named Jacek Holowicki. I'm not sure if any of you knew him, but he was a powerlifter out of Popeye's gym, and that's where I competed out of as a powerlifter back in the 80s. And Jacek was taking a little time off competition. He got in a little bit of trouble for something, you can guess. And Jacek was doing his PhD, and he was this Polish fellow with a very strong accent, and he was quite jacked. And a lot of people don't realize Jacek Holowicki is what made Stu McGill Stu McGill. Stu McGill went on to much fame and fortune and wealth and many books. And it was really Jacek from Popeye's gym that actually established that, because Jacek basically came and said, everybody's training the back the wrong way. Everybody's got weak backs. They don't understand how the back works. And he did some of that preliminary research that showed the function of the whole bracing and multiple systems involved in core stabilization. And he was the one who did the fluoroscope image. If you read Stu's first book, they were fortuitous enough to have a power lifter doing a deadlift, and they were looking at their spine using a fluoroscope, and the powerlifter actually injured his back. And they talk at length of this. Well, that powerlifter was a guy named Steve Chomitz, who competed out of Popeye's gym as well. So that just set everything forward for Stu McGill, reinventing what we understand about core stabilization and core training and back pain and that kind of thing. But also at University of Waterloo, this is where I did my kin degree. I started in 1988. Was a fellow named Mike Houston. Mike Houston was a biochemist, physiologist, and he dabbled in strength conditioning, but he actually was a bit of a runner, and he came out and wrote some articles and taught us how steroids did not have any effect on our human physiology. And so that was kind of interesting, because we all were looking around going, well, I don't know if that's true or not, because we know a lot of guys using this stuff and they're doing pretty good with their Dr. Houston. Anyway, he was a good guy, but he was very inquisitive, and he was interested in strength culture, along with Howie Green to some extent, which you've heard that name already. Howie Green was also a physiologist, did a lot of testing. But Howie Green at that time had a PhD student named Jean Ramsey. And John Ramsey was a Quebecer. And if you don't know much about Quebec, Quebec culture is strength culture. It has a long legacy of strength and sporting history. It's just a part of pride in the culture of Quebecers to be strong and proud of their strength. Lumberjacks in the winter, pushing farm plows in the summer. But Jean Ramsey in 1988 handed me, similar to what happened with Chris Dalcin, handed me an NSCA journal article on the periodization of training. And then he also handed me a few other articles. One actually wasn't BOMPA, it was in Medicine, Science, Sports, and Exercise. And in 1988, I learned how to do periodized training. And I started doing these kinds of programs, and I went from this skinny little nothing powerlifter to top in the nation, junior nationals, in a year and a bit, and everybody thought I was on the sauce because of these periodization principles. It was the first time it kind of started making sense to me. But a lot of you don't know, well, we've mentioned McMaster, but there was also a hub at that same time in the 80s in Ottawa. A fellow named Dave Harris. Dave, shout out if you're on this. He was going to try and get on this week. But maybe you know the names, Charles Polquin, Lauren Goldberg, and then there's a couple other strength guys. One's a Highland Games guy, I'm not even remembering, but there was a group of 5 guys that started strength training for sport out of University of Ottawa, and they all were in the same program around the same time, and there was no faculty, but these guys just caught on, and you know some of those names have gone on to be quite influential in the strength conditioning industry. So between University of Waterloo, McMaster, and Ottawa, there was a lot of strength. The birth of strength conditioning in Ontario occurred, but in the 80s, we were still bodybuilding. I started powerlifting in the 80s. In the 90s, I started doing some strength conditioning, and there was nothing. So I ended up going to the States to learn how to be a proper strength coach, because there really wasn't much going on up here. And the NSCA seemed like the only answer at that time. Anyway, I'm just going to give a little bit of background of some of you may not know of powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, and strongman, because in Canada, Ontario was the hotbed for all those things. Even though Quebec had a strong strength culture, the first organized Olympic weightlifting took place in Ontario. And as early as 1913, there was gyms in Toronto that were running informal meets. And then in the 1920s and 30s, they actually started to formalize and form the Canadian Weightlifting Federation. And, you know, we've been around forever now in Olympic lifting, but it wasn't until the early 1970s, a group in Hamilton, a guy named Bill Jameson, who was the host of my first powerlifting meet ever in Hamilton, 1973 formed the Canadian Powerlifting Union. And out of that came the Ontario Powerlifting Association. Basically, the powerlifting back in the 60s were called the odd lifts. Like nobody was really, it wasn't organized because Olympic lifts were the main thing. And then the IPF formed, and a few countries, I think it was 5 or 6 countries joined early on. It was 6 nations that joined in the early 70s. And then boom, powerlifting grew and grew and grew. Now, you think that some of the stuff is pretty popular now, but you don't understand, when I was competing in the 90s, early 90s, powerlifting meets, you go to a national championship, there'd be 30 people competing. That's it. A provincial championship, 30 people competing. For weightlifting too, it was the same thing. Now you'll go to a national powerlifting competition, they're capping it off at 550 people. It's just in the last 10 years, and that's largely been thanks to CrossFit. Then strongman didn't start in Ontario until the early 80s. It was a bunch of, well, it was mainly Quebecers, but they learned from the American and some of the strongmen going on down there, like the Bill Kazmaiers, and then some of the Europeans, Magnuson, those kinds of things. And they started mimicking that. And I remember the first strongman competition in Ontario, I think was 86 or something like that. I went to, it was in Toronto at the CNE. And that was interesting. I knew a couple of guys competing at a Popeye's gym. Anyway, so that was just a few tidbits of history for you about Ontario lifting. I didn't want to go too much more into mine because I went to the US, I learned stuff, and then I came back. And by the time I came back, things were starting to roll. So that brings up Steve Lidstone, because Steve Lidstone was getting things done during that time. So back to you now, Chris.
Awesome, Trev. That was a nice little segue there. I really like that you dropped some of the other names of people that, you know, could easily be on this. Lauren, Dave Harris. I think Ed McNeely's another name we could have on here. To the whole panel, what other names? So let's go back. Who else did you guys look up to in the 80s? You dropped Charles Poliquin. I'm curious who you guys were, who were your mentors? You know, Chris gave us a really nice presentation on that, but tell me a little more about who inspired you.
For me in Canada, I didn't have any. Unfortunately, all mine were in the US. Because again, back then, just where I was, there really wasn't anyone. I think there was 100 of us certified as strength conditioning coaches by the NSCA in Ontario at that time. So all of mine were American, unfortunately, other than say this John Ramsey, who taught me the periodization. He was perhaps the first. And then a few powerlifting meatheads, Corey Bakers and the Steve Chalmeses, that I learned a little bit from. But that's it for me.
Ian, Sheldon?
Well, one person who was, and again, this is probably early 90s, was Peter Twist. And Peter was actually a classmate of my business partner, Barry Shepley. So Peter was also a Mac grad, and then left to go out to BC. So I actually, we stayed in touch with Pete before he started his company, actually, while he was just starting with the Canucks as their S&C coach and into working with the Canucks. So I actually went out and spent some time with them out west for a little bit as well.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Peter Twist, but from a Canadian standpoint, even watching Renzetti work, he was in A4A, and what he was doing with Draper, it was amazing. So I've got to say that was probably my first real glimpse into that lifestyle and what needs to be done in the prep work.
For me, even as an undergrad, there were two kids, I wish I could remember their names. They were classmates of mine. They were French Canadian, both of them. And they were both competing and training daily as Olympic lifters. And I asked them if I could come by and watch one of their sessions. And I just looked at this and I went, why aren't we all doing this? This is amazing. And sure enough, they taught me the skill back in the day. I probably learned it wrong, but ever since that moment, it's been a big part of training plans for me. And then Trevor, you brought him up to one of your courses up at your school. He was from the States. Older gentleman, had a hip replacement. He ran the course with you. Do you remember his name?
Yeah. Oh yeah, Richard Borden. So yeah,
yes.
He was my main mentor for sure. He was
a big guy with the NSCA, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was president of NSCA for 4 years. He's an international level Olympic weightlifting coach. He was the dean of the College of Health Professions, where I did my strength conditioning at Northern Arizona University. And he's still kicking to this day. He's still coaching, although he's quite ill right now. He's in his 80s. And I visited him last summer down in Utah. He splits his time between Utah and Arizona, and he's still developing athletes. It's crazy.
And I think they used to run a weightlifting, USA Weightlifting ran a club coach program at NSCA conferences.
Yes.
It was the one in
yes.
Colorado Springs, which I took it. And I'm pretty sure he was teaching it back then. This has got to be 96.
Yeah, it would have been.
And that was just, when you saw it more broken down, the kids that I learned from were just doing it. And I remember taking it and helping them work with two guys on our football team. One ended up having a long career in the CFL. The other one should have played, but was injured. But then you saw the technical side when you went down to NSCA conference and took that course. I think it was an eye opener. So, and then just at the Fitness Institute, we just had great people as our mentors that coached us. And here's one of the premises, Chris, of the fitness that back in the day was it was open door policy for any national team athlete. You want to see a shot putter squat. They come in and they load up every weight that we had in the gym on the squat bar and do their squats. And one of the premises that Bill Gardner put in place of the fitness is if you're going to come here and train as many hours as you want, whirlpools, saunas, showers, towels, no matter what you want, but you have to do 2 hours a week of training of our members. So you'd get the national team shot putter showing members how to, like 60-year-old members, how to squat with the bar. You just hang on their words, I'm telling you. But to Trevor's point, a lot of it was bodybuilding back then. A lot of it was just getting big for the sake of getting big. Until, like I said, we started hearing about Verkhoshansky and Tudor and some of the other great minds. So those are kind of my, again, watershed moments when it comes to training.
This is great, and I think it's important for all of us to hear these names. You know, it's easy for us to dive into all this new stuff coming out, but I think people should be spending a lot more time digging into the classics, digging into these old names and seeing what they done, because that's where it's all started. So I'm really thankful that you guys have put all these names out. We'll jump over to Steve now, our last co-panel host, as we go into the 90s a bit. And when we get to questions, we'll kind of dive back. But Steve, if you want to jump in here and give your story.
Yeah, you know, once again, I think like Ian said, it's pretty humbling to be on a panel with these giants, from Chris to Sheldon, Ian, Trev. I'm not sure if I belong with this group yet. Like I just started in the 90s and 2000s, and it's humbling to hear or see some of the presentations, especially Chris Dalcin's PowerPoint slides, because so many memories come flooding back for me. You know, I attended George Brown College first. I grew up as an athlete. I played football and basketball and any sport I can get my hands on. But for me, you know, the idea to dunk a basketball was, I wanted to be like Mike. You know, so playing basketball, sprinting, running. I played tailback and linebacker in football. So I just love to hit people and run and jump and do those things. And, you know, my watershed moment for me was grade 9, 10 phys ed class. We did fitness testing, and I thought I was a pretty decent athlete, but when they posted up the scores of our vertical jumps and our bench presses, the first time I'd been tested, I didn't do so well. I was, you know, bottom of the barrel. And so I went home and asked for that Weeder set, that York barbell book, for Christmas. My parents got it for me. I started posting up pictures of David Robinson, Carl Malone. Those were the guys who were training back in the day. And just started lifting and putting myself through what was not a good, you know, training program, but at the same time, what York Barbell had out, very similar to what you see Trev show on his background. So that was it for me, man. I started training, and the next year I went back and crushed it, and just really started to dunk a basketball in grade 10, grade 11, and started to realize that weight training, skipping rope, sprinting, running stairs, all those things really started to make a difference for me. So that's what led me to George Brown College. I wanted to study training and performance. You know, I didn't really think my undergrad at the time, I was being recruited for football, but I didn't have the best grades, to be honest. So I ended up going, okay, what is the best route for me? So I went to George Brown. Going to George Brown, I you know, quickly with Bo Kent being there, and that's a name that Chris Dalcin mentioned, when they say that 1 out of 3 of you will graduate from this program, you take it pretty seriously. So of the 80, you know, we were going to get 25 of us or so that were going to graduate. it was pretty intense. There were many people that were book smart but couldn't handle the practical applications of what we did there. So all the 3-stage bike tests, the ECG testing, the everything that Chris showed earlier was what we were being grilled on in order to be able to perform at a practical level. And I really enjoyed the practical component of it. So that helped lead theory to practice. And then from there, I started, I had a placement with the high performance specialist, which was owned by another person that Chris Dalcin mentioned, which was Michael Clarefield. So that was my first placement under Val Skeffington and Andy Smith were the two strength and conditioning names that really impacted me early. Matt Nickel was there as well. But basically what we had was the top floor was sports medicine with Clarefield, people like Chris Broadhurst, Rory Mullen, you name it, you go down the list. Chris Jackson, those were all gifted therapists that were working with pro teams at the time, Toronto Maple Leafs, Rory Mullen, now with the Raps. But they were therapists that would come down and hang out in the performance center where we had high-speed treadmills, Cybex $1 million reactors for agility and eye-hand coordination. We had testing units for vertical jump that had basketballs attached to it that would go into the ceiling, and athletes had to jump up, like you're measuring vertical leap differently. Doing agility work, I really quickly started to mesh together what performance training was, and it was not barbells and dumbbells. Those were a means to power and speed, and I really started to really enjoy that. So I had a placement there. They hired me afterwards. I worked there for about a year, but that's where I first started to train. We had the Leafs there. So local guys like Wendell Clark, Ty Domi would come in, Tennis Canada, National Ballet of Canada. All these athletes would come and get treated, CFL players, and then they get treated upstairs, and then the therapist would walk them down and take us through their injury history and then tell us what they wanted us to start with, and then we would put together the rest. So it was really my first exposure to an integrated support team. I didn't even know what an IST was, but that's where it all kind of happened for me. After that, I went to York and studied AT and strength and conditioning concurrently. I think the AT was, being exposed to the Clarefield's clinic. I really needed to put more together as far as the return to play and performance. So being at York, we've already heard the names. Tudor Bompa was my periodization prof. His wife taught me one of our Pekins, which was dance. It's hilarious, but he and his wife were both big instruments of learning for us, and especially Tudor. So sitting in lectures with him, he would bring in Charlie Francis, and Charlie Francis would talk to us about what he was doing as far as he was very blunt and open about the doping schedules that his athletes were on. He was a chemist and a speed coach. That led me to going into the York Track and Field Center because it was right there, and watching Charlie coach and learning about speed development and seeing things there. Those were the big things for me, I guess. While being at York in my undergrad, I started training our basketball teams. There was no strength coaches there. Steve Bodanis, he was one of my strength and conditioning coaches for football when I was there. He was working with football, but there's no one really working with a lot of our teams. There was no full-time coaches in the OUA. So I started working with our basketball teams there and training them based on everything I'd learned at George Brown and the high performance specialists, and then just started doing some good things, I guess. And while studying AT to learn about rehab and return to play, I graduated, and then the rest is history. I applied actually to Teachers College. I was accepted to Teachers College at York. I thought I was going to be a kin or a phys ed teacher. I didn't realize strength and conditioning was actually a profession within the country. It wasn't yet at the collegiate level, and that was a big part for me, was just getting an opportunity to learn from some of these people. Chris Dalcin was, when I graduated from George Brown, he was at the Fitness Institute. I remember going and working with him probably 2-3 times at the Fitness Institute in the back room doing testing on the New Jersey Devils. So that was my first exposure to Chris Dalcin and working with him. So that was pretty cool. Just knowing that I was meeting some of these people that we're now talking about is crazy to think about. But once I graduated from AT and kin, I declined Teachers College. I'd been nudged by the profs or the coaches at York that they were hiring a full-time strength and conditioning coach. I put my name in the hat. I got an interview. I knew I was interviewing against people from across the U.S., Canada. People were being flown in for the interviews, and it was a panel interview, so it was pretty nerve-wracking for me. But I think the George Brown placement and also the position at York, I think I got it because I was more passionate than anybody else. I don't know if my knowledge was at the same level, but I definitely wanted it more than anybody. So I got the opportunity to be the lead strength coach at York. I had a huge learning curve on how to program for athletes. I was placed with 14 teams. It was a whole new level for me. So although I'd been training the basketball teams, this was now taking on 14 teams by myself. And I knew there are things I need to get better at. And one of the things was Olympic weightlifting. So I ended up actually fortunate. Dan Church, the hockey coach at York at the time, let me know that Hockey Canada on the women's side was looking to bring in several strength and conditioning coaches from around the country. Jason Poole was the director then for strength and conditioning for Hockey Canada, and he was looking to set up satellite strength and conditioning coaches. Asked me if I was interested. I said absolutely. They flew me out there, and that's when I first started to meet Matt Jordan, Scott Ma, Price, you name it. Those coaches were all, Mac Reed, they were all working at the CSI Calgary, Karen Kendall. So, I mean, without going through too many names, quickly my network of strength and conditioning coaches and mentors exploded, and I had a chance to learn from these guys. I guess I did something right because they started bringing me back, and then started learning from all those guys, and then brought what I was learning back. But I remember being in the Olympic Oval doing testing and training, and even getting more excited about everything I was doing. And then having seen the amount of weightlifting that Matt Jordan was doing with his athletes and Scott Ma, and knowing I had to come back to Ontario and find someone to teach me, I ended up reaching out to Jill and Ken Miller up in Collingwood, Ontario. So I would work as a strength and conditioning coach from 12 noon to 8 p.m. As a full-time strength coach, but in the mornings I'd wake up around 5 a.m., drive to Collingwood, and Olympic weightlift with Jill, primarily teaching me with video, dowels, and she wanted me to learn to compete for her club. I just wanted to learn to be a coach. And if I was working with football, rugby, sports with high impact, I want to learn Olympic weightlifting. So I went up and learned from those guys for about a year, 3 mornings a week from 5 a.m. till about 10 a.m. and then would drive back and work full time 12 to 8. So it was a crushing schedule, but at the same time it was awesome. York led to a ton of stuff that was pretty amazing for me, getting to work or be mentored underneath Charlie Francis. Brent McFarland was another one, and Andrew Yap started showing up around the track centers, learning speed from those gentlemen. And then I just started getting nudges in different directions. Hockey Canada was one. Basketball Canada started coming and doing training, or ODP and JDP, so started working with Basketball Canada a little bit. And then Francis Flint, our director for athletic therapy at York, was a sports psychologist who worked on return from injury. Gave me the name Jason Burnett, who was a trampoline phenom, and I remember working with him, who obviously Chris took over with. Just like as Dalcin said, like there's so many paths that opened up, and I just couldn't say no to any of them. I just started going and working with Scott Livingston in Montreal with the Habs over 2 or 3 summers, helping out with their training camps and things like that. Just wanted direction and guidance, and that's what kind of led me down all these roads. And then from York, we started doing pretty well in sport, winning OUA titles. We had no business winning against the larger schools like Mac. So McMaster came calling, and that's how I got to meet a lot of people. Hired as the strength and conditioning coordinator at McMaster in 2007. So that was unique for me, was coming in October 2007 and just now being in charge of a program, not just the sole strength and conditioning coach, and being able to mentor a lot of different students like Chris Chapman, and man, you could go through a list of people, but that was where I first had the opportunity to not just be a strength and conditioning coach, but to mentor future strength and conditioning coaches. And that became my new passion. I'm not going to lie, like training athletes is great, and going to an Olympic Games or Worlds or whatever it might be is amazing, but winning Vania Cups or whatever was awesome, but it was the mentorship to the students that really drove me. And their feedback allowed us to build programming that I now do at Brock University. And, I'll probably pretty much end there, but just being able to work with a variety of different national teams and just be humbled by the experience of just being able to mentor a lot of great people has been a highlight of my career for sure.
Amazing, Stephen. This is actually the perfect segue. When I think of all 5 of you guys, you would all give the shirt off your back for the students that you teach and the people that you mentor. You know, I could talk stories about each and every one of you, but let's start talking about more panel questions now. What are the things that you look for in a student that you want to take under your tutelage that you think has what it takes to succeed? Because you guys have obviously produced and influenced many of us who are on this call and who aren't on this call. So I'm curious to hear from you guys, you know, what do you look for in that person? And what has led to a very successful strength coach?
Caring and critical thinking. I'll jump right in there at the start. They're easy to pick out. You know, you can take on a bunch of interns. A lot of kids want to sign up and learn more. And usually it's about 1 in 10 that kind of show that caring and critical thinking that will take them to that next level. And by caring, I mean, they want to do more, they want to learn more, they want to show that they can get the job done. They want to make sure that the people that they coach are treated well, that the people they work with, that they're making them look good. So that's all in the caring thing. And then the critical thinking, they're the ones who will hear something and say, does that sound right to me? And then go look something up and figure out if it makes sense instead of just jumping on the bandwagon. You get those two things and you can coach up the rest.
I would add to that. I look to athletes. I like, if you're going to train athletes, I think it's good to have an athletic background. You don't have to have been a world-class athlete, but at least, you know, be competent and have some physical literacy to you. But hungry and humble would be the other thing I would add. You've got to be humble enough to understand you're never going to learn, like, know it all. But hungry to put yourself through as much as possible to develop some empathy for what training truly feels like, and go from there. So those are the big things that I look for when I'm interviewing students every year and taking on future students that I'll mentor are those characteristics.
I'm keen on character above everything and anything. I'm keen on working with somebody who looks out for the team first. I'm keen on working with people who, if there's a piece of Kleenex on the ground, they'll go out of way to pick it up without anybody having to ask them. Character for me is a huge thing. And I'm also interested in dealing with people who are optimistic, people who are going to make mistakes. And I can tell you, I've made a bazillion mistakes, but not be fazed by it and learn from it and move on, and not to hold grudges too, because life's too short. So again, character for me is actually at the top of the list. I'm more interested in dealing with a character person than a smart person.
Ian,
I'm probably
Chris?
ditto on the case of an ex-athlete or somebody who's trained as an athlete, whether it was right or wrong, but critical eye, just looking for small little things. Not distracted, and I say that probably in the new era of technology. I see people, you know, they say they're coaching, but they're looking at their phone. The athlete's looking at their phone. They're texting, their heads down. That wouldn't have happened in the old days due to technology, but I think all things off, the person that's doing the exercise is your major focus and your only focus, and you're looking for subtle little nuances that are going to help them get better. There's a great graphic by Steve Norris put out. We've all been touched by Steve Norris. Is, you know, at a high performance level, that window of improvement is closing rapidly. So it takes a trained eye to look and fundamentally try to use that time to enhance them, because again, it's you got to do a lot to gain a little in high performance sport. So being distracted would drive me crazy. And to Sheldon's point, working in the public facility, call it a public with high performance athletes, is there's somebody before you and there's somebody after you that's going to use the facility. He mentioned the Kleenex. What drives me nuts is putting weights back. Just keep the, you know, respect. If they got no respect for the facility, I don't think they have the respect for the athlete or themselves, honestly, because would you eat off a dirty plate? So that's a bone of contention, like Shell.
Ian?
I'm cutting in and out, but hopefully didn't repeat anything, but I agree with everything Chris said, Sheldon said, Trevor said. I like a guy who wants to read, because I know I'm old school and I'd rather read a manual than look at a YouTube video in a sense. And that's this generation. I gotta understand that. But you know, somebody wants to read, wants to investigate and be proactive themselves, not just what do I do next or sit down and do something, go on their phone. So that's what I look for: enthusiasm. What are we doing today? You know, that kind of thing. But a good demeanor, good mannerism, somebody that'll show up.
Nice. Let me throw kind of an opposite one. What is the biggest red flag you guys all see, and the one behavior or one trait that you think either kills it for people or that makes you tell them, you know what, you should be in another profession?
Overconfidence. Yeah, I've had so many interns come in saying, I got this already figured out, get out of my way, I'll do this, I've got it. And they've read an article somewhere or watched a YouTube video and they've got it all figured out. And it's just so hard for them, as Steve says, I'm looking for humility, so hard for them to come down from that and admit that they were bit off more than they can chew with this stuff. It's just, I've run into that so many times where I've tried to mentor those individuals and it's just turned into a train wreck. So I try and cut that off pretty early in the vetting process.
Retardiness. If you're not early, you're late. And to Trevor's point, I know it's off the strength and conditioning, but it's part of the process for me. Everybody that came from George Brown College, U of T, York University did placements with me. The first thing I make them do is calibrate the metabolic cart. If they come back to me after they've done it once and say, yeah, I've got it, well, you shake your head like, okay, you've got it, right? And then push comes to shove. Next week, we got 6 athletes and I say, okay, go ahead and calibrate the equipment. They can't even put the Hans Rudolph mouthpiece together, let alone go through the process of calibration, because I'm a stickler for that. It's just go through it 20 times, 30 times until it becomes part of your DNA. I don't care how smart you think you are. It's a process that takes time. That's one thing I like as my little test case scenario.
For me, it's over dependence on research. And again, if push comes to shove and you have the chance to read a paper or go and speak to a coach who is part of the research, go and speak to the coach. And having a really good understanding of where research falls into play, because the reality in our field, practice tends to precede the research. So I would rather somebody who has a good understanding of the research, but it's not the end all and the be all.
Anyone else? Steve or Ian? Are we good to keep going here?
Go ahead.
I say keep going.
So given we were talking about 80s, 90s, I'm curious what you guys have seen come and go over the years. Trev, I've seen you give an amazing talk on fads. I think it was at maybe CPTN or something. So I'm curious what you guys have seen really come and just die out and kind of been a joke of the industry.
I got a great one.
Oh, me too. Got a couple.
Trevor, remember the equipment called Can-Am? It was pneumatic.
Oh yeah.
And it had no eccentric loading.
Yeah, concentric only. Yeah, there were gyms everywhere. They were the answer.
Everybody had them. Canadian manufacturer, and we're going. And then you start doing the reading and finding out how much eccentric plays on strength development. You're going, and then they just gathered dust. And I'm looking at these things and going, but I just love the fact that what goes around comes around. You know, going through the old books, how kettlebells were non-existent for the longest time, and now they're all the rage, and you got to see them in every gym, and I love that. You know, old is new again. to be the opposite of it, but I can't think. Other things that have died. That's a good one. I have to
There's
think
a
some
lot
more
of them.
about
Oh
it.
my gosh.
The Nordic track.
Nordic track, yeah. Absolutely, that one. I had a member at one of the fitness clubs I managed saying she would quit unless I bought a Nordic track. I said, well, it's nice knowing you. They were all the rage. But I was going to say Fitballs, my friends. Remember in circa 1996 to 2000, you'd go to every NSA conference and there's Juan Carlos Santana bouncing on a Fitball, talking
Standing
about
on it.
stabilizer training, and then he fell off and blew his MCL 1 year, but it's another story. But Fitballs, like, gosh, every person in the world had a Fitball that they were standing, kneeling, or lying doing the workouts, and falling off all the time. But that was probably, in our strength conditioning industry, that was one of the biggest, longest lasting flash in the pan bullshit ideas that ever existed. Not that they don't have their place, but that was probably up there. But on your point, Chris, if you guys get a chance, I love the history of strength culture. Go back to the 1800s, 1900s, and read old books from the 1920s, the 1890s, stories of Sandow, the history of York Barbell. Everything we do today, they did back then, and oftentimes did it better. It was amazing. We are so out of shape now. Our athletes are young, robust population who are average Joes compared to what some of these guys were pushing. There's a book I have called The Truth of Weightlifting, written in the 1920s. That was an expose of false vaudevillian strongmen. And it quotes several strength feats because basically they're saying what is a normal strength feat versus what is BS. And I remember reading this one thing: a strapping man of 90 kilograms should be easily able to take a weight of 100 kilograms and bench press it. What a bench press is?
Have you cut out there?
Oh, okay, sorry. So they were saying a strapping man of 90 kilos should be able to bench press, or no, it was, sorry, not bench press, one arm snatch 100 kilograms. Like, it was like, if you've ever tried a one arm snatch 100 kilograms, that's a lot of freaking weight. And so we get pretty excited up here if we're two hand clean and jerking 100 kilograms sometimes. So there were some phenomenally strong things going on. Kettlebells, club bells, everything was taking a weight from the floor and lifting it over the head. And these guys just through training hard, got it up there. And was it the best way? No, but there's a lot to be learned from that. We spend so much time worrying about some of the minutia and sometimes not worrying enough about just grinding it out a little bit, putting in effort.
Yeah, again, the thing about the 80s too is everything was about machines. So Nautilus, everything was, you had to sit down and push or sit down and pull. So there's nothing dynamic about what people were prescribing in the 80s.
Oh, HIIT training. Remember HIIT training before it was HIIT training? So you guys, a lot of you guys may not know that high intensity training, that term was actually initiated in the 80s from Arthur Jones in the Nautilus, #1 Nautilus fad. #1 Nautilus, you walked into a room, you hopped on machine #1, you went on each machine, there's 20 machines down a row, and then you left out the back end of the gym, and they were selling these memberships all across the world. Well, strength conditioning in the 80s and early 90s, well, even into the 2000s at some of the best schools and best pro teams in the US, Penn State, Michigan State, Washington Redskins, Arizona Cardinals, was HIIT training. I was a security guard for Arizona Cardinals back in 1995. And I watched as they moved the transport trucks full of machines up to the end zone of our indoor training stadium. And I looked at the workout. The strength coach sat in a desk the whole day, and he handed out this 23 exercise workout, all muscle isolation, and 1 set to failure. That was HIIT training, high intensity training. And it was like a religion. It was like a cult.
It was
and
the first variable resistance too, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, variable, that was the argument. So doing omnikinetic, omnikinetic resistance, and then from that hammer strength kind of came off that. But Ken Manny from Michigan State, Matt Brzezicki was another big name. There was some big people pushing this, and training multiple muscle groups together was a waste of time. It was stupid. Anything moved fast, just used momentum to move the weight. There was no force being generated. It was just incredible the vitriol that came from them. It was like a political cult. They would just hop on you and try and crucify you if they found out that you didn't agree with their system. It was incredible.
And they had a series of 12 machines that if you went through their, 3-second negative, 2-second positive, 1 second, through all 12 machines for 12 rounds each, they said you got an aerobic training, so you didn't have to do cardio. They were selling this. Nautilus Total Fitness and Nautilus clubs were popping up everywhere. Made Jones multimillionaire.
Oh, incredible.
First gym I ever joined was at Young and Shepherd, and $20 a month.
I remember that gym, Chris.
Young and Shepherd, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I see Sam's comment in terms of it was curved. That's exactly what it was, but with machines.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember training some of my first clients at a Good Life Fitness on one of those things, man. It was crazy. The other thing that was thrown in here was the ab roller too. The ab flexion.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
that thing.
classic.
1 and 2.
Yeah.
So guys, what I'm going to do, we've hit 2:30 now, and I'm really hoping all of you will come back for part 2 next week, because we're actually just getting started with the questions.
Okay.
So we'll leave it at this actual question. I want you to stew on more, because I know we're going to come up with some more things. But this has been absolutely incredible. Thanks, Chris, for the long overview, and the rest of the panel. We could do this all day, but we had a lot of time. We're going to stick to it. So let's get everyone back next week, and let's keep this going.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Thanks, guys. Good times.
Good job, Chappie.
And I make one last call out. The CSCA newsletter, the spring newsletter, is going out on the 30th. So make sure you subscribe before that, because we have some pretty phenomenal articles in there. One in particular, which I think will be of interest to everybody on isometric training. So make sure you subscribe.
CSCA subscription.
Thanks, panel members.
That's online, eh? Or on the website?
Yep, just go to the website.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, team.
You guys next week. Thanks, chaps. Great questions.
Appreciate it. Go Habs.
Attaboy, Steve.